Well, it started when my neighbor actually was involved in an incident of domestic violence. And this was in Vermont, in a small rural town. She lived next door to me, and she was severely beaten by her husband. And she called me in the middle of the night for help. And in the process of this, which is a long story that I won't go into, I started looking around for a woman attorney to help her. And at that time, in 1975 in Vermont, there were no women attorneys in Windham County, and there were no women judges. So I decided to go to law school. And so my interest always in the law was very specific. It was about how I could help women and how I could use the legal system to best benefit them, and perhaps add a little bit of clarity to what was happening with domestic violence in our country. After law school, I worked for legal services, and in fact I did a 2-year project on domestic violence. And I really had no interest in going on the bench. I never thought about it. I wanted to litigate issues. I wanted to represent women in court. I enjoyed that. But we actually only had 2 women on the bench, one of whom was Shireen Fisher, who's currently serving now as the president of the Sierra Leone Tribunal. We had a women governor, Madeline Kunin, and she decided to address the issue of the lack of women on the bench, and she appointed 10 of us at once. I think we made the New York Times. It was a big deal. And she was looking at that time for senior women in the legal profession in Vermont, and I was one of them. And so I became a member of the Judiciary. I was appointed in 1990, and I believe it was 1991, I went to San Diego for the National Association of Women Judges Conference. And at that time, they were having a meeting of the then fledgling International Association. And I saw all these women dressed very exotically, women from Africa with their turbans and beautiful clothes, and women from Korea all dressed up in their sort of native garb. And I was really intrigued, and I followed them. And I just, I had this moment of, part of what happens, I think, when you're in the legal profession, although we should never have tunnel vision, we often do. We sort of get involved and intensely focused in what we're doing, and we sometimes forget what the big picture of justice is all about. And that moment was a real eye-opener to me when I realized, listening to the judges' stories from all over the world, is how much we had in common. And it really didn't matter if we came from a civil system or a common law system. We essentially had many of the same problems, and were dealing with certainly the same issues that were affecting women and children in our respective countries. And so I became a big fan of the IAWJ, and I was fortunate to go to the Rome conference. And at that time, the then director, Arlene Pack, called me up and asked me if I would consider facilitating a workshop. And I thought, I know nothing about, she particularly wanted me to do Asian judges. And I literally, I hate to show my ignorance, and I will right now, but I knew so little about Asia. And I thought, well, I'm a member of this organization, they clearly need people, I can facilitate a meeting, I'll go. And so I agreed to do that. And the meeting was, part of what we were supposed to do was then introduce the concept of women judges sort of banding together, forming organizations, and trying to address the needs of women and children in in their countries, and what obstacles we would have to forming these organizations. And I thought, well, how difficult could that be? I mean, it's pretty much basic standard conversation. And it was because I was probably so ignorant about the politics, and I had cheerfully sat everybody around the table, and I gave them a little Vermont state flag where I was from. But I put, judges from Bangladesh next to Indian judges. I had Korean judges next to Japanese judges. I had Taiwanese judges next to judges from the People's Republic. I mean, it was pandemonium. I mean, nobody wanted to sit together. Nobody wanted to work together. And I was horrified in a way, and naive, obviously, but horrified that we as women, who were all, I assume, committed to the same thing, couldn't sit down around the table. And I remembered trying desperately to find something that we had in common. And all I could think of was to ask this question of, well, okay, so you're on the bench. And I said, we all have things in common. And I remember one judge challenged me and said, what do we have in common? And I said, well, okay, for example, when you're on the bench and you get your period, what do you do? And there was this moment of silence, and I thought, oh, save me here. And all of a sudden the judges just burst out laughing, and everybody started talking, and they were like, yeah, of course we have things in common, and yes, we have that in common. And of course some judges were older and said, we don't have that problem anymore, but we have different problems. And so we got this very lively discussion broke out of what it really meant to be a woman on the bench. And from that we could then talk about the more serious issues, about what we saw with litigants coming into the court, and how our courts didn't serve women and children, and if there were solutions to that, and if as women judges we could, because we understood perhaps their point of view, and understood what it was like to be perhaps oppressed by power structures, and we were, for all intents and purposes, in a power structure, how could we make that journey a little bit easier through the courts? And that led to me traveling further and going to China for the Fourth World Conference on Women, where we did and presented a workshop on domestic violence. From there, I was a family court magistrate in Vermont, and my jurisdiction was primarily child support. And we had started a system really from scratch, and so it was pretty interesting for me from a judicial point of view. But I had done it for a number of years, and I was really getting tired of it. And one of the things that happened at this conference that when I was in Rome was one of the Chinese judges came up to me, and when I was explaining what my jurisdiction did, she said, oh, how blessed you are to be able to hear cases involving the support of children, and to be able to actually do something to help children in such a concrete way as grant them financial support. And I have to say, that's how I felt. But to hear it expressed by someone else in such a moving way to me made me just grateful to be a judge, and grateful to be able to do this kind of work. And the reason why I say this is that I think one of the things about working internationally is it gives you a window into our common humanity, and also it gets you to see your job in a different way. And I've had this experience with judges all over the country who have been kind of tired, a little burned out, and they, by getting involved more internationally and with global issues and see their job in a bigger picture, get revived. And so I thoroughly recommend it. But to just to keep going a little bit further to get where I am today, and we can, one of the other opportunities that the IWJ had given me was the opportunity to represent them at The Hague in treaty processes. And this opened up another whole world to me. I had mentioned Judge Fisher before, and when I first got appointed, she was my mentor judge. And she had left the bench by this time and had gone to The Hague to she actually had gone to London to live and get her PhD in human rights. And she was interested in the children's treaties. And the two of us formed this team for about 5 years where we worked on these treaties. And that was an interesting experience because there were not very many judges involved in treaty work. And to add that sort of practical component to how is this actually going to work, and having the hat on of the IWJ meant that we had to be familiar with all of the legal systems of the 90-some countries that were involved in the treaty process, so that we could be recommending or speaking towards provisions of the treaty that would actually satisfy all our members. And that was very challenging, and I got to learn a lot about international work. And from that, eventually came this opportunity to be on the War Crimes Court.